Good evening, one and all. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Freddie Adelman, and I have the honor of directing the Smithsonian Associates. And I could not be more excited that you are joining us for the final program in this series called CULINASIA, the Future of Asian Food in America. Collaboration with the Smithsonian's Freer Gallery of Art, the Arthur M. Sackler Gallery, and the Smithsonian's Asian Pacific American Center, this free series explores food legacies and the ways in which Asian diaspora cuisine continues to change and enrich our lives. CULINASIA received federal support from the Asian Pacific American Initiative's Pool Fund, which is administered by the Asian Pacific American Center. As in the three prior programs, tonight we'll hear from participants whose heritage and experiences span the complex spectrum of Asian diaspora identities in the United States as they discuss successes, challenges, and the future of Asian food in America. I've been an audience member for all of these programs, joining hundreds of others from all across the country. We've heard conversations and interacted with more than 20 participants, ranging in age and experience from high school students to longtime community elders, all of whom are involved in food work with sources in more than half a dozen Asian countries. The topics spanned authenticity in recipes, family memories, farm workers' rights and climate change, the broken restaurant system, and supermarket politics. The discussions were deep, infused with generational pride, a recognition of cultural nuance, nostalgia, resilience and redemption, humor, hope, and an unapologetic championing of the value of Asian food culture in this country. Each of these conversations was powerful in its emotion and its impact, and they all seemed to end way too soon. The CULINASIA series was conceived before the pandemic, but the experiences of our Asian American neighbors, friends, colleagues, family members over the last 15 months have made these conversations even deeper, richer, and more urgent in their themes. We've emphasized that Chinatowns, Koreatowns, Japantowns all across America are vital historic immigrant communities that tell eloquent stories of culture and cuisine, and even more importantly, give us a guidance into what it means to be American. Our participants have moved us to honor the generations who built those communities and moved us to join in supporting the current generation whose innovation is continuing that growth and protecting the future. Before I turn things over to this panel of esteemed guests, I also want to thank all of our members and supporters, those of you who support the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, the Smithsonian Associates, and the Freer and Sackler Galleries. If you'd like more information about any of our programs, you'll see some links to all of us in the chat. And now it gives me great joy to introduce the curator of the series, Simone Jacobson, and she will also serve as the moderator for the rest of the evening. Simone Jacobson is a cultural connector. She co-owns the Burmese American restaurant Thummy here in DC. She has more than 15 years of experience in the arts and cultural management. She's contributed to large-scale events at the Smithsonian, at the National Museum of Asian Art, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and the Museum of Food and Drink in New York City. Her writing has been published in a variety of forms at the Washington Post, Eater, Gawker, Fusion. You'll enjoy the evening with her. And please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Simone Jacobson.
Thank you so much, Freddie, for that beautiful introduction. I just want to take a moment to say to you and to all of our colleagues at the Smithsonian that for me, as a first-generation daughter of an immigrant mother from Burma, it's really a true pleasure for me to host this series, to co-host with all of you, and it has been a very meaningful experience. Thank you so much.
It's our pleasure. We're delighted to have you. Thanks again.
And thank you. I see so many people in the room with us tonight, the Zoom room. And I know you're all familiar with Zoom by now, but before we turn to our guests, I want to just point out a few key features that will enhance your virtual experience with us tonight. We have so many great guests with us that we won't have time for a traditional Q&A, but we do encourage you to make comments in the chat. We'll look out for them, and we encourage you to look out for links from us and information that we'll be posting there. If you experience any technical issues and you need to contact our staff, you can use the Q&A box to request virtual assistance. The program this evening will wrap in about an hour and a half. And you may have also noticed that this program includes an ASL interpreter, as well as closed captioning. If you prefer to hide the captions, you can click the CC or closed caption icon on the toolbar. And finally, please take a moment to complete the exit survey at the end of the program. We read every comment and we truly value your feedback about this new forum for learning. We have been so engaged and grateful to hear from each and every person from these exit surveys. We've learned a lot about how we can make the future of hopefully CULINASIA and other events with Smithsonian partners. And now a few words about our panelists today. Nguyen is an independent farm owner, operator, and social justice activist. Mai applies their background in climate research and Buddhist farming to cultivate regionally adapted heirloom grains and Vietnamese seed crops. They also organize farmers of color for economic democracy through worker and agricultural cooperatives and equitable agriculture policies. In 2017, Mai helped pass the Farmer Equity Act, a momentous civil rights bill for California agriculture. Mai is also currently co-director of Minnow, an organization focused on land tenure for farmers of color while supporting indigenous land rematriation. They have been recognized for their farming and advocacy work as a 2019 Berkeley Food Institute Changemaker, 2018 GRIS 50 Fixer, and 2020 Rachel's Network Catalyst Awardee. Ari Delania is the owner of Kamayan Farm, a small vegetable, flower, and medicinal herb farm located on Snoqualmie land just east of Seattle. Prior to farming, Ari spent 10 years working in environmental and social justice movements, supporting communities in their struggles for food sovereignty, freight transport justice, safe re-entry from prison, and climate justice. Kenny Likitprakong, an Asian American Jewish Sonoma County native, is the owner and winemaker of Santa Rosa's Hobo Wine Company. For 20 years, he has been trying to balance building a responsible business, growing a family, and living on this planet. Hobo is a small winery leader in decreasing the carbon footprint of a bottle of wine by making smart environmental decisions that benefit the planet and his business. He has been featured in the San Francisco Chronicle, the New York Times, Sunset Magazine, Modern Farmer, and various other publications. Kenny supports the local community through organizations like the Climate Center and the School Garden Network, as well as many other nonprofit organizations beyond Sonoma County. And Kristin Leach farms in Winters, an agricultural town in the Central Valley. She grows primarily Korean and other East Asian crops with an emphasis on heritage seed preservation, as well as breeding Asian vegetables for organic systems. Her project, Second Generation, started as a collection within Kitazawa Seed Company, and now is a collective effort to support communities of the Asian diaspora intending to our respective food traditions and wisdom. And because tonight we're exploring the future of Asian food in America, our event format and approach is also somewhat non-traditional. Tonight we'll be folding in 3 exciting elements, just like bakers fold in their ingredients to their mix. Our conversation will begin with Mai, Ari, Kenny, and Kristin in a roundtable format, followed by a speaker tag where our speakers get to ask each other their most pressing questions. We'll end with a wine tasting with Kenny, exploring the intricacies of 3 of Hobo Wine Company's best varietals. And for those of you who purchased a wine kit, we'll give you a heads up when it's time to drink along with us. And for those of you like me without a wine kit at home, we'll get to hear more about Kenny's vision and process, and maybe we can just imagine ourselves drinking those beautiful wines, which I have had, by the way, just not this evening. They're really quite extraordinary. And before we look to the future, we'll come back to the present. Please join me in welcoming our speakers, Mai, Ari, Kenny, and Kristin to the virtual stage. And I know that for some of you, it's been a challenge because you're farmers and the power goes out and there's no electricity where you are. And so we are especially grateful to all of you for making the efforts and for being with us tonight. It's a true, true pleasure and honor. So I'm going to invite all of our speakers to unmute their mics so we can hear them in all of their glory. And I have one very, very simple question to start us off this evening. I would love to know what you grow and why you grow it. So I see Ari there with her mic off. So maybe Ari, we'll start with you.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Ari Delania. Like Simone said, I own a small farm just outside of Seattle, Washington, and I currently grow a really diverse array of vegetables. And I try to focus on vegetables that are part of the Filipino cultural traditions and of the Asian diaspora. I also grow a really wide array of flowers. We have a flower program where people can purchase bouquets every week. And we grow a small amount of medicinal herbs as well, although that's been waning in the past couple of years as we've had to just do a lot of pivoting during the pandemic.
Thank you, Ari. And Kristin, what do you grow? Why do you grow it?
I too grow mostly Asian mixed vegetables, and I focus on Korean American crops. And I grow seeds for other farmers and gardeners to grow vegetables as well. And that's what I sell through Kitazawa and a few other small seed companies.
I'm getting so hungry talking to all of you. These panels have all made me so hungry. All right, well, maybe I'll move to Kenny because that'll make me a little less hungry. What are you growing over there? Why are you growing it?
We pretty much just grow one thing, grapes for wine. We have a couple of ranches in Sonoma County and a few down in the Santa Cruz Mountains. We do have about an acre of vegetables just for eating and for fun.
And what kind of veggies?
The range. We're not growing too many Asian vegetables, some bok choy, but a lot of just typical backyard garden type of stuff, tomatoes and squashes and things like that.
I'm gonna have to send you some of Kristin's seeds. Hi, Ma, you made it.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks so much for having me and hosting all of us. And yeah, on my part, I grow heirloom varieties of wheat, barley, rye, and then I also, as you said earlier, I grow Vietnamese, mostly nightshades and some roots and squash for seed. And the reason why I grow all of those is I think it's important for us to have as much of a full diet available locally as possible. And the grains I've selected for these really old varieties that have withstood the tests of time and have adapted them and selected them based on their drought resistance, which is really essential for our conditions in California. So not just thinking about our whole diet right now, but looking forward as well. And in terms of the Vietnamese seed crops, that's a part of me connecting with my community that has given me these seeds, really entrusting me with them so that I can grow them out, save the seeds, and keep sharing them within our community.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful, Mai. Thank you so much. Mai, while I have you, can you tell us a little bit about how you got into farming and your relationship to land ownership?
I just saw Kristin's face on the land ownership part. So yeah, exciting stuff when we get there.
We're just gonna go right in, you know, like we're all here. It's the last one in the series. We're just gonna go right to it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're certainly related, and that, you know, for my community, Vietnamese people, you know, I'm first generation. Our community mostly came over as refugees, and so my own personal journey has been figuring out what does it mean for us to make a home here, because we can't go back. And in particular, how food is a part of us being able to have a bit of home, something that, like any home, it's your foundation, it's the place you go back to, it's your respite. And just with food, the way that it can be something that is grounding, it's one less thing to think about in a whole new environment, a whole new set of relationships you're trying to develop, a whole world that you're trying to figure out. So I got started farming because I wanted to grow Vietnamese crops for my community, for my family. And as I got further into farming, as you had described in my background, I was a climate scientist and thought a lot about our food miles, our food infrastructure, and how that contributes to climate change. And I wanted to farm, both for us to maintain this deep cultural heritage, but also it's a part of just our bodies, but also how this very physical link is also tied to this global system of our climate environment, and that by growing more diverse crops, it's a part of fighting climate change. That biodiversity is a part of making sure that we have not just a resilient system, but just one that's healthful and bountiful. So that's how I got into it, but a big barrier for me to really implement a biodiverse system, right? To take care of all the animals and do long-term planning in terms of having rotations with multiple crops and have perennials that are also really important for example, storing a lot of carbon. The roots of trees, there's carbon coming from the atmosphere, right? We need that. And it doesn't really make sense for me as someone who's been leasing to then plant trees that take 5 to 10 years to fruit, and I might be kicked off by then. And that's been my experience, is that I've had in my 6 years of farming with my own business, but in total, even before I had my own business, when I was working on other farms, my experience was farmers getting kicked off of their land, and so my employment ending early, or for myself, having to move 3 times in the past 7 years.
Mm-hmm.
So that lack of land security impedes my ability to make sure that we really are building up soil that has enough organic matter to retain water in our drought-ridden system, to have the rotations that create a rich soil microbiome, and for animals and moving sheep, in my experience, has been very troublesome. So those are just some examples of how my lack of land tenure has gotten in the way of me being able to really fully contribute what I know I can contribute to fighting climate change and ensuring that we have regional food security. I'd say also, I've given the amount of times that I've had to move, but the number of or just the yields that I get from my grains based on what I've been able to build with the soil and the seeds I've selected. It's like this year, I'm one of the very few wheat farmers in the state who actually has a crop, because I've done this work to soil. And so imagine what I could do if I actually had land security, right? It's like right now I'm one of 4 farmers outside of the Imperial Valley who has a wheat crop. And so, just imagine how much more I could feed people if I had land tenure.
Yeah, I mean, would you say that it's comparable in a way? I know before we had this conversation this evening, we were all talking together, and you were sharing a little bit about some of the challenges of rural farming, rural living versus city living. And I wonder how comparable it is for you to gentrification, in the sense, for example, when artists build up, all of the vibrancy of a neighborhood, of a community, and then are, the insecurity, housing insecurity, how that relates sort of to your lack of land tenure. Is it comparable? Is it more complicated? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, when you bring up gentrification and its applicability to rural areas, yes, the gentry also love rural areas. So gentrification does exist out here, and you have people buying up second homes as their place to get away to. That seems bucolic, right? And there's one instance right now. I hope this person isn't watching, and I hope this doesn't jeopardize my possible like renting of their land. But it's like they live in Marin, which is a very wealthy part of California. It's just north of San Francisco, and they just purchased a property that has 30 acres. There's a really small unit that it doesn't have like a kitchen or anything. It has basic plumbing. But anyways, it's like, so they've purchased this land. It's prime agricultural land, very rich soil, class 1 soil. And I think just adding to what you're saying about who owns the land is like, they own the land, they don't know how to farm, and they're interested in having a farmer there mostly because we have something called the Williamson Act in California that requires certain parcels under that act to be continued under farming, and the owner gets a tax break. And so sometimes people will just have like a hobby farm so they can get that tax break. So it's wealthy people who can afford a multi-million-dollar property gets a tax break by having a farmer like me, who's desperate for land. Like, you know, they invite me to farm it. And at the same time, what happens, it's not some sort of benevolent system where like, oh, great, I get this like farmland for cheap. It's because they don't understand farming, they put on a lot of restrictions. Like they're like, okay, well, we want to be able to look out our window and see something beautiful. So like, can you make sure that you have like all these flowers and hedgerows? I'm like, I don't produce that kind of flower. I produce flower with a U, not a W. And that, you know, then they don't want noise at certain hours. Like, well, nature doesn't work that way. We have to run our machines at these certain times. You know, they're like, in the summer, we don't want anyone here. It's like, well, when do you think food ripens? And so there is the compounding issues of one, they're owning the land and not putting it into farming. And if they do, then putting a lot of restrictions that impede farming. It really also drives up property values where, for reference, 20 acres in Sonoma County, 20 acres of prime farmland with no house on it, maybe like zoned for a small unit, like a 800 square foot, will go for, at this point, like $3 million.
Wow. Yeah. I see Kristin nodding along there. Kristin, tell us what's on your mind.
No, I mean, I don't think I could put it as articulately as mine, just kind of spelled it out and really broke it down. But yeah, I mean, I also was not as ambitious of a young person or as brilliant in my younger years. And so I got into farming just from working and being able to do manual labor. Like, it suited me. I liked the pace of it. I liked being outside and, you know, working on small diversified farms in mostly the Pacific Northwest. Just realized, like, I saw a disconnect between what was considered kind of like healthy and local food with the food that my community was eating, or that I was interested in reconnecting to different crops. And so, yeah, I mean, I think kind of fell into it a little bit and had a side hustle growing Asian vegetables once I moved to the Bay Area, just because there was such a vibrant food culture and lots of really
I can imagine you, was it like a side bag situation, like a side hustle, just like, do you want this one vegetable?
Yeah, it was a little bit like that. Like, I just tried to grow a couple Korean crops on farms where I could use a little bit of land in exchange for managing their bigger farming operation. And so got to just test the waters and grow things that I wanted to reconnect to. And yeah, there was just really amazing cooks and sous chefs and chefs that were interested in just using food as the medium for telling the story of their culture. So it was just kind of a nice synergy just in terms of the timing. And then to a lot of Mai's points, when I was an adolescent, the thing that really stuck with me was growing up in the late 90s and within this anti-globalization movement, and seeing the fact that, landless peasants and small scale farmers were, kind of building some of the most substantive, rejections of this iteration of capitalism that we had seen. And so I think that was really compelling. And I just, I guess I laughed at your question of what's your relationship to land ownership, because I think a lot of us are like, we don't own land, and we are faced with the reality that we probably won't ever own land. And yeah, just the challenges that Mai spoke to. And I know that, Ari and I process and talk about a lot as well. And just to emphasize Mai's point, like this reality of, if you look at statistics of who are tenant farmers versus who mostly owns land, especially in a place like California where it's so expensive, just to say, like farming is grueling enough. And when you have this added toll of the kind of constant emotional labor of just making people like you, kind of bridging a lot of cultural divides, dealing with a lot of other people's expectations that are just around like their subjective cosmetic preferences and lack of understanding of just how gnarly a working farm is. It's like, it looks picturesque and like Sunset Magazine, like a very small portion of the year. And the rest of the time, it's just always in process. But, I think that process is equally as beautiful. So yeah, it ends up being a series of intersecting and compounding problems. And I think, yeah, Ari in kind of this peri-urban area as well, and in Seattle where it's experiencing a lot of the same problems as the Bay, can speak to a lot of those same issues.
Yeah, we're looking at you, Ari.
Thanks, Kristin.
I love it.
Yeah, I also laughed at the question around land ownership. So I farm east of Seattle, but I farm probably 15 minutes away from Microsoft's main campus. We also have Facebook and Amazon and Google here. And so I think the question around gentrification is really applicable to my land ownership picture or the lack thereof. Land prices here are incredibly high, and there's a lot of competition and people who have recently accrued wealth within the past couple decades who really like the idea of owning a very large parcel of land. So there is rarely land that goes up for sale here that's agricultural land, and when it does, it's never under $1 million. And that's usually for a very small parcel of land. So I think, yeah, Mai articulated it really brilliantly. I think we're all facing these intersecting crises around climate change and housing. For example, my farm is in an active floodplain, so you can't actually build housing on my farm. So I live in Seattle and commute out to my farm, which is a pretty common thing for farmers in my area. And when I say active floodplain, I mean that anywhere from October to May, my farm could be 10 to 15 feet underwater. So you can imagine that you would not want to build a house here. Mm-hmm. I did also just want to share part of my journey to farming, and I think it maybe in comments that Mai and Kristin had. My sort of career path started in the environmental justice world, and I spent a lot of that time talking about and doing activism around food justice, including doing a lot of urban agriculture work. And maybe about 8 or 9 years ago, I ended up in DC and was doing federal farm policy work and research. And it wasn't until I got to that job that I realized I had no idea what it meant to farm rurally. And yet my job was really to represent and advocate for farmers. Mm-hmm. So now when I hear farmers talk about like the type of soil that they have, or some of the more technical aspects that for us is just sort of a common language, I very much realize that most people don't have any concept of what that means. You know, I think the current statistic is that 1% of America farms, and it's a very, very minuscule percentage of that that is Asian farmers. And so I think, yeah, I had this realization that I really had no clue what farming looked like in rural areas, or even at scale. And so I just felt this calling to actually get in there and do the work. And there's another sort of like vein that I come to farming through, which is that I studied to be a somatic practitioner for about 7 years. And somatics is just a modality of healing that really works to move trauma through the body. And so part of my approach to farming and my philosophy around farming is really like understanding how our bodies relate to land through the various sort of lenses and viewpoints that we come from. And specifically as people of color, what is our relationship to land, and how is that embedded in our body?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's really what I wanted to get into with all of you, is a little bit more, maybe we'll start with Kenny, but about, I think it's really important. It's something that I've seen, you know, as a restaurant owner, and I'm actually currently in Mexico meeting with a lot of natural winemakers. And in that process, I think it's been interesting for me to see that a lot of times the people who have the most, the people who have a lot of the resources, tend to think the least about values and philosophies around how and what they grow or what they're doing with their business. But I think it's really interesting as I get to know each of you a little bit better, and throughout the evening, our audience as well gets to know you, that people of color in general, business owners of color, you know, the networks that we're in as Asian American and BIPOC restaurant owners, seem to have the least and care the most. And I don't mean to overgeneralize, because of course this is something that touches all of us who interact with food, whether it's as restaurant owners, farmers, etc. But I do think that it's important for our audience to hear a little bit more from each of you about your specific values and philosophies around how and what you're growing, around the work that you're doing with edibles and drinkables. So Kenny, can you tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing there at Hobo Wines, about your specific philosophies and values?
Yeah, well, I think we've all had to struggle a little bit more, and so then it connects you to other people who are struggling, and you want to try to help people struggle less. I mean, we feel that way very much, like just with our employees and the people we work with. We want their lives to be better. We want the lives of everybody who our business touches to be better. And so for us with farming, simply put, like everything we farm is organic. We try to have a pretty strict policy about what we're doing, and be really good stewards of the environment, also worrying about what the people working in the vineyards are, you know, subjected to and what they're around, and try to make it as safe and clean and healthy as an environment as possible. And I think that carries through for us all the way to the wine, and we want to communicate that message to our customers as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for you, Kristin, can you tell us a little bit about how that partnership began with your restaurant partners, and then also sort of how that connects? I imagine that some of that is co-created and some of it is synergy, right? That we gravitate towards the partners that share our values as well.
Yeah, definitely. I had just met the brothers who own the Namu restaurant group while I was at a different farm, and I was growing kinnip, like Korean perilla, just outside of my little trailer. And another restaurant owner just said, "Oh, there's these guys, they're doing this cool kind of California Korean concept, but they'd probably be really excited to have some of this." And so I just kind of weirdly, I stalked them when I would see them at the farmer's market. Oh, there's those cool brothers that have that cool restaurant. And I would just bring
the hip hop brunch, right?
What's that?
They used to do a hip hop brunch there.
I don't know what that is, but it sounds very
It's
cool.
like cool, like hip hop music. They call it hip hop brunch. I think I went there once.
Oh, probably. Yeah. The youngest brother is a DJ. So yes, yeah, they do lots of cool things. And I was just like this dorky farmer growing this herb outside of a tiny janky trailer. And so I would just bring this little box that I had specially packed, and I brought a special mister to the market, and I'd just be, you know, there with that box. And I think it took me probably 4 weeks of bringing it and seeing them, and before I worked up the courage to approach them and bring them some of the crop that I had grown. But once I brought it to them, their reaction was so visceral and so immediate. And I had grown perilla as like a means to kind of reconnect to Korean heritage. And so to see people that just had this like deeply entrenched nostalgia and love for it, just made it click automatically. I was like, oh, they love this crop. I love this crop. Whatever ways this crop was brought into our lives, it's this kind of ambassador to connect us. And so it was just great. And for me, it just started, I had just been, you know, working on these different farms, which I had a lot of experience and a lot of ideas, and I didn't have a lot of capital behind me. And so when I was approached by my employer that I could sublease some land from him, the brothers from Namu stepped in and said that they could put down money for me to secure my lease, which was like $1,200. And we just sort of set out from there, but they really backed me. They believed in what I was doing. And I think that the type of risk sharing that they've endeavored to do with me is really substantial for tenant farmers, for beginning farmers, for farmers that, you know, growing Korean heirloom produce, like, I think a lot of times, like even with Korean Americans, they were the hardest on some of these crops just because it was familiar and yet not at the same time, just because they were a little bit older. It skipped a generation from what people were familiar with at like the Korean markets in the US. And so it took like this narrative building and conversations and community building. And I think just having this partnership with the restaurant let me have some room to do that. And they were just good thought partners, and they helped feature these vegetables too so beautifully. And I just got to learn a lot from them, just how they used the vegetables. I got to taste them in these amazing iterations. Sometimes the first time I had eaten these vegetables was just because I grew it. So yeah, it's just been really exciting.
That's beautiful. Does that resonate with you, with your, with the Asian American Farmers Alliance? Do you feel like there are a lot of shared values and philosophies there, or are you constantly kind of building on the ideas of the farmers in the network?
So with the Alliance, which Kristin and Ari are part of as well, we are very much connected through our shared values about as being anti-racist Asian American farmers and farm advocates. And we decided to be rather a small group of anti-racist Asian Americans rather than being an Asian American Farmers Alliance where it's just like any Asian American farmer would be a part of it. I think that needs to exist. There is a need for that, but because of how we see our work as deeply related to the need for collective liberation and our work to be in solidarity with other people of color, that's a really core value for us that enables us to move quickly in response to social disasters, as well as building the groundwork together strategically. I want to go back to the topic of these partnerships and hopefully to the audience and thinking about how the audience can be a part of essentially risk sharing with us. I think we've heard so far some of the risks that we're facing. We haven't even gotten into beyond like what being subjected to floods means for Ari, or drought or wildfires for the rest of us, right? But just knowing, I think I don't know if you really need to know that much about farming to know that it's very risky. It's like nature plus climate change, very risky. But I'm so happy to see the partnership between Kristin and Namu over time, and how they've stuck together, and what's come out of that too, just like what they've shared, and what's been made possible because of the support that Kristin's received from them, and then how that's really built this like incredible community. And Kristin is a superstar in not just the Korean American like food and community in general, but just like the farming world. And for me, as a person who's growing these heirloom varieties of wheat such that we can have truly whole wheat that doesn't exist in the stores at all, to have wheat that is drought resistant and flavorful and part of our food security and sovereignty, because it's seeds that we can actually save, and I won't be sued by a chemical company for having just saved things that I grew and replanting them. But my relationship with Kristin Toll, for example, that mill, is like, not only have they, for example, like, you know, paid up front for my grains when they're like, or, you know, it's a high cost of production. They've gone in on experimenting with flour share programs, you know, and pivoting with me when the pandemic hit, such that, you know, I really had the financial resources to come into the next year for production. But also when Kristin is talking about being able to taste things that we've grown, it's like, I'm not an expert miller, and Kristin Toll turns my flour into this like luxurious, pillowy flour. And then they also do the R&D to bake with all these flours to be their like best selves, you know, and so I get to taste, you know, the Chidon Blanc de Mars as an incredible like hand pie, or like Sonora wheat as this, you know, just like olive oil cake that, you know, gives me like lovely daydreams when I'm burning up in the field. So that kind of risk sharing is being done, you know, in these pockets. And what I would really love to see is more people stepping up to help us farmers, not just in these sort of immediate monetary ways, but also when we're thinking about how we need this total change in our food systems that were already failing us and then got really broken apart with the pandemic. What structural changes that we need to make through our farm bills, and who's getting subsidized, and how we can access land. You know, I really hope people can see, like, through these examples, what a difference it makes to have that kind of partnership and that risk sharing, and that we can do that as a society.
Yeah, I mean, and getting a little bit deeper into that, as we were coming into our conversation tonight, we were talking a little bit about some of the particular challenges that farmers of color, not just Asian American, but in general, farmers of color face sort of that adage, right? Twice as hard, 5 times, 100 times as hard for half as much, or a fraction. I know that some of the things that we had discussed as a group about, you know, Kenny and I had talked about how we, you know, need to market appropriately and differently. And, you know, I do want to hear, Kenny, a little bit about your specific relationship with your father, also because I think that obviously I can relate to that in a family business of my own. I know that's something really personal and specific, but in general, as we're talking about these specific challenges for farmers of color, you know, there's trend. There's also that sort of insider-outsider line that we're walking, you know, as Kristin is talking about, you know, even within our own communities, often mostly within our own communities, they are more critical because, as you know, the saying goes, same, but different. It is similar to something you remember, but it's not quite. And so that hurts, right? It hurts your heart that it doesn't taste quite the same, or maybe it's different in some way. Maybe it's better, but you're just not emotionally or spiritually willing to overcome that barrier. So I want to just kind of open it up, and maybe we can chat a little bit together before we get into our panelist tag about these specific challenges for farmers of color. And maybe I'll just start with you, Kenny, because I do also want to hear, you know, as first generation working with your father, having this Banyan line specifically, ideally to pair with Asian foods. Sounds like it started out. If you could chat with us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, so we started Banyan, I guess 20 years ago, my dad and I, and we were looking for this sort of intersection between wine and Asian foods, and we made a handful of different wines that we thought would pair well with Asian foods. And we also were kind of frustrated with what we were seeing on wine lists in Asian food restaurants. And, you know, a lot of wine that just didn't work well with the foods, and thought that we could change that. You know, working with my father was
super trailblazing too. I mean, even now in 2021, you know, restaurants, Asian restaurants specifically, are just starting to look outside of, you know, the sort of European catalog. And even then it was not really pairing, right? I mean, it was sort of like, there's wine here, but also that's not how we drink in a lot of Asia, right? It's a lot of whiskey and beer. And so that doesn't mean that, you know, wine doesn't pair with our food. It just means that there was, I think, a lack of desire for ingenuity there. And it is, I mean, when you get the right wine, even the sommelier community, right? They don't know what to pair with our food. And so that leaves this opening of innovation, but also then trying to honor those flavors, right?
Yeah, and I think that the opportunity there is that it could be a uniquely Asian American thing, because you don't see these kind of things in Asian countries so much, but where the cultures kind of come together here, it could happen. Working, you know, starting that project with my dad was a lot of fun, and it gave us a lot of, you know, time to do things together and be together. But ultimately it was, you know, pushing the rock uphill the entire time, and it was it's difficult. It's I mean, we still try to do it, but it's a difficult battle. I mean, people, I guess it's the owners a lot of times of these restaurants just don't want to help fight that battle. They want to kind of just make it easy, or do what they think is going to be easy. And you know, we try to educate, we try to like sit down and maybe work on pairings with people that own the restaurants, but it's hard to get those opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's tied into what Mai was talking about too, right? It's that we all need each other, right? That we're all interdependent in this network, and it's not just restaurant owners and farmers, it's also diners, right? And we need to create a craving maybe for a fruit or vegetable or wine pairing even. And I think to your point, that's really it's a really salient point that it could be, and it is becoming a uniquely Asian American thing, right? Because otherwise the opportunity, for example, a placement on a menu or collaboration for a flower or wine or whatever it may be, is going outside of our communities when already the opportunities for us are less, right, to begin with. So I am actually going to shift gears, because I know that we have a lot to say, and I have a feeling there'll be some overlap, because this is my favorite part. And so selfishly, this is my favorite part to have our panelists think about the number one burning question they have for their co-panelists. And we took some inspiration from the Oscar-nominated film Minari, the semi-autobiographical story of a Korean American family that embarks on a new kind of American dream, traveling from their California home to a rural Arkansas farm, where they nurture their father's hopes of growing Korean produce to sell to vendors in Dallas. And Minari offers us a unique opportunity to explore the larger themes we're talking about tonight also. The importance of representation and family legacies. And so with this in mind, we're going to start our little panelist tag, and I'm going to tag Kenny.
So Ari, I wish I could see your farm, and I wish I knew you better, but just kind of like looking at your website and reading about what you're doing, I'm kind of just wondering, as an Asian American, like what your message or your mission is, and how you're able to communicate that to your customers.
Thanks for the softball, Kenny. It's a good one. Yeah, I think that my message and my mission has changed over the years, depending on like what my relationship with the land is. But I guess I'll answer it in saying that the farm for me has been a place to just like reconnect with my family's stories and with my family's cultural foods. I think what Kristin said about, you know, tasting some of those like foods that belong to you for the very first time can be a way of just like coming back home to your family and generations, even if there have been like ruptures or if there are stories that are lost. I think for me, growing that food has been a way to kind of reconnect and put together pieces of my family story that I don't necessarily have all of. And I think my mission, I suppose, is to create space for other people to do that, whether that means like I'm growing the food and I'm bringing it to them, or we also, before COVID, did workshops every year that were specifically for BIPOC, our BIPOC community, to come experience the land and also be able to be here and be in choice about how they're on the land and what their experience of it is. And that's in part because, you know, so many of us have histories in our family of forced migration or forced labor, and there are really like traumatic embodied memories of what it means to be in relationship with land. And I think a part of my goal is to allow people to experience land in a very resilient and joyful way, whether that's just through eating the food or through being able to be here and experience what it's like to pull daikon out of the ground for the first time, or what it's like to see bitter melon growing. Because especially for people who are part of the diaspora, it's really hard. Like you can go find maybe like an Asian grocery store and see those things on the shelves, and they're usually like wrapped in styrofoam and plastic. And that's like pretty incredible that those things are available. But I think it's an entirely different experience to see it like living in its full life. And, you know, like on Kristin's farm, one of the things that's so special is you get to see the entire life cycle. Like you get to see something go from a seed to a baby to a fully grown mature plant and then back to a seed. So yeah, I think that's part of my message and my mission. In terms of how I get it out to the world, I wish I had a better marketing answer for you. I think I've done a lot of work. I do a lot of activism in my community, and I'm really involved in organizing efforts here. And so I think I'm really fortunate that people just know of my work in my local area. And then I hate to say it, but I think Instagram has really allowed me to connect to a lot of different people and to a lot of other Asian American farmers. And I think it's a really useful tool, and I think there are downsides to it, but it has been really helpful for me in terms of not only allowing my work to be seen and to be shared, but also like being able to see so many other farmers who are doing similar work from different angles perhaps has really helped me understand why I do the work that I do.
I get to be the radio announcer to say, Ari, your next question. Ari has a burning question for Mai.
Yeah. So my, you know, one of the things that I know about you, and maybe through some assumptions that I've made, is that you are just really connected and responsible for a lot of people in your lives. And I think that's a pretty common experience for first generation folks. And I'm just curious, like how that kind of broader network of people informs your work as a farmer, and what do you see as like the pros and cons of that?
Thanks for asking that question, and thanks for noticing. Yeah, there must be a lot of messages where I'm like, gotta go, gotta take care of this person.
Well, you're also a pretty new parent, and so you're balancing that and farming too, which I think is, I wish people understood how hard that is.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Plant babies are very different than human babies. But just, yeah, recapping your question about how my connectivity to others sort of influences my farming. Is that right? I got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's helped me think a lot about how I've come to be here, what has made it possible for me to live the life that I have, to have the health that I have, the spirit and energy, and then also what I want to pass on. And so my legacy as a part of a continuum has been a big part of what community has taught me. I mean, especially knowing that in my home country is we fought off colonialism from China for over 2,000 years and retained our identity. And then also through French colonialism and Japanese imperialism and the Civil War, that in order for me to be here, it's taken a lot. And more acutely with my parents escaping with their lives, not knowing if they would ever see land again, right? To understand that they've made that journey, and also all these other people in my life have also made that journey. I feel deep gratitude that, recognizing as being a parent, what I give to my child, it's not a transactional relationship, right? My child is never going to repay me the like many nights that I've had to wake up at 1.5 hour intervals to like make sure that they go back to bed, right? You can't ever pay it back. You can only pay it forward. And so in thinking about growing these drought-resistant crops, which I thought was something that would be beneficial to society maybe like 20 years down the road, you know, it's turning out to be beneficial now. And I can see that there's still more work to be done, and that just the way in which my ancestors have stepped up to make sure that I can be here today, that all of us can be here. I look to our ecosystems and the ways in which they've supported people here, look to Indigenous peoples who've also interacted with these ecosystems and have enabled us to be here. And so I'm only connected to only so many people, but that has helped me understand a broader interconnectedness that I will never fully comprehend, but that I know that I have a responsibility towards. And it really, yeah, it does inform, you know, what I decide to add to the farm or not ever include in the farm, because I have that long view of being connected for generations to come. Yeah, thanks for asking.
Thank you.
Well, the question that I had for Kristin is kind of related, and I'm excited that in the prepared trajectory of question asking that I get to ask Kristin a question, because we often joke about how we're both so busy that the only time we get to hang out is when we're invited to speak on the same panel. And even then, I don't usually get to ask Kristin a question. But I've been wanting to know, also as a new parent, I'm like coming on a year, I've been wondering how parenting has informed farming for you, and also the ways in which you feel like farming has informed your parenting. Also, are you sleeping?
I know, side thread, there's a lot to talk about. It's all delirious. Wow, that is a good question. Well, I guess in short, I had at one time felt very confident in my capacity to do a lot with very little sleep. I felt like I, as a farmer, had already humbled myself to the forces that felt greater than me. and surrendered to a certain amount of chaos and anarchy in the hopes that it would eventually transform into some emergent dynamic synergy. And having a baby has disavowed me of all of those notions. Like, I didn't realize how poorly my brain could function and how little sleep you actually get. Like, now I'm like, oh yeah, working, a full day on the farm with like 4 to 5 hours of sleep is so luxurious. Like, yeah, you're saying it's like this circuit of 30 minutes and waking up. And I think it just pushed my threshold for both. Like, I had thought before my daughter was born, like, okay, this really commits you to hope. This commits you to accountability for the future. Like you so beautifully said, like, I think being someone who cares deeply about my relationship to seeds, and that seeds and plants were these beings that invited me into this conversation that I hadn't previously felt like I knew a way into, in terms of that continuum of feeling cared for and feeling like my ancestors left something for me, these breadcrumbs to find my way back. I now have this physical manifestation to think about it in the more immediate, whereas before I would think about it just in, grander terms, in terms of the people that I would never meet, but I still wanted to convey a message to. But I think, when Una was born, I definitely just felt a hope that just she gave to me. Like, I didn't have to muster it. I didn't have to find my courage to give to her. Like, I think she instilled a lot of that within me, just to know, like, sometimes I'd look at her and want to shake her and say, tell me what you know. Why did you come here right now? Because it seems crazy to me. And so I just admire her, her spirit for coming here. And at the same time, it's definitely deepened the terror that I feel. Like, she was born in last June, and, as a newborn, pretty much was subjected to like 8 weeks of, the worst air quality on earth at that point. And so there were just nights, like the first night she actually slept 8 hours. We were like, this is awesome. And then we're like, wait a minute, is this smoke inhalation? Like, should we actually be really worried? This is really bad. And so I think it just really brought home a lot of things. And I think just on a personal level, being a responsible parent, being a responsible partner has meant for me to take a hard look at how much the farm has been all consuming, and how much I've had a sort of luxury to kind of, really center my life around that. And I think, just being in my late 30s, like, I started reflecting on the things you sacrifice, like the life events you don't show up for, the ways you can't show up necessarily as like a great friend during the months of May through November. And I think it's helped me recalibrate a little bit of my priorities in ways that have been meaningful, and make me think about, just the way I show up in community, just because it is such a hard time right now. So I think already just in her 1 year on this planet, she's definitely made me a more gracious person, more thoughtful, a little bit more resilient, at the same time as completely breaking me down like a cult leader would, where I am so pliable to her will and her needs. She's completely programmed me. So I am weaker in one regard, but immensely stronger in another. So, but thanks for letting me talk about my cute little baby. And I'll ask Kenny, on this thread of, this multi-generational conversations and things, I've been so interested in hearing more about, your project as this intergenerational father-son project. And I'm just curious if there's anything you can share, just knowing how much food and wine, hospitality can just be this beautiful backdoor into hard conversations, or things shared over a meal just end up prompting things that you wouldn't normally want to talk about. If there's been surprising moments for you in working with your father that's brought you closer together, or things that you felt like helped you bridge your different experiences and your different generations, and how food and wine served as a conduit for that.
Wow, that's I think it's, at the minimum, the amount of time that we got to spend together has created a more of a bond between us, or strengthened our relationship. It's the fact that we get to do something that we both like together, I think, is also been really great. And it's like when I think about my own children, I sort of want them obviously to find their own path, but I also kind of think about if they were to like be on the same path, it's like, or finding things, I guess, that you like together really is helps with bonding. My dad tends to be a very quiet, private person, so I think it's more about the time we've got to spend together than really like kind of like breaking down any barriers, I guess. There's things like, I think, especially like given our differences, like he grew up in Thailand, I grew up here, and it's really hard even as a father and son to like kind of bridge that gap and like be able to relate to each other in that way, because it's such a different upbringing. I think we both really want to, but it's not always that easy. But having the project together and spending the time together is a huge thing for us.
I just have to say that Freddie put it perfectly at the beginning of our discussion. She said all of them are too brief. This for me could be 4 hours, ideally with some Asian veg and some perfect flour and some wine. But for those who purchased a wine kit, we're going to give you a moment to get your kit ready to taste with Kenny. And for the rest of us, this is a crash course in wine, an introduction to Kenny's craft. So I'm very, very excited about that. I think that Kenny will have numbers, but also names with the wine. And I want to encourage our panelists because in the spirit of mutual benefit and also the true expertise that you have, that I think this is also a time for us to be able to continue our conversation. So we are, I think, a rowdy enough bunch that we may interrupt you a little bit, Kenny, but we're eager to hop in and to get into the wine tasting, even though we have a little FOMO without a glass here. I'm drinking some Topo Chico. It's not quite as exciting.
Yeah, please interrupt me. I also just want to say that wine pairing is not my field of expertise. Like, I'm interested in it, but really like growing grapes and making wine is there are other people who are the professionals when it comes to putting food and wine together. But with let's just get into it right away here. And wine number one, I have a glass in front of me. I have the wine. So wine number one is our Folk Machine Riesling. So we have a few different brands that fall under the Hobo label, but I don't know if you guys, this is what the bottle looks like. And this is, the interesting thing about Riesling, I think, when it comes to pairing with Asian foods, is Riesling kind of spans a large spectrum in terms of sweetness, which most other wines don't. So you have Rieslings that are very dry. This one's pretty dry, up to like very sweet. And I think that's interesting when it comes to Asian foods, because especially depending on spice level, like a spicier food can kind of work well with a sweeter wine versus a less spicy food. Maybe you would want to go drier. The other thing I would say with wine in general with Asian foods is the tannin levels. I think tannins and Asian foods don't tend to work too well together. I think there's maybe a few exceptions, like maybe some barbecue type of stuff, but generally, like, it's a thing to avoid. And white wines in general, we're doing 3 white wines here today, and white wines in general tend to have a lot less tannin than red wines. So this Riesling comes from Arroyo Seco, which is kind of central coast of California, pretty old vineyard. And like I said, we make it in a fairly dry style and try to keep the wine kind of light with a lot of acid. And I think that works pretty well with the sort of spectrum of I mean, to me, Asian food, again, very generally speaking, tends to be more playful, more aromatic than a lot of other cuisines. And again, there's so many differences among Asian cuisines that it's really hard to make these generalizations into like, you really have to look at almost specific dishes with specific wines. But in the interest here of just trying to be general, I think Riesling is a pretty safe bet for, I would love to see many Rieslings on every Asian restaurant's wine list.
Can you tell me what Thai or Asian dish you would eat or you would like to eat with that particular wine?
Yeah, like, I mean, I guess in Thai food, I would, even things like, I like to eat like just like street noodle soups and that kind of stuff, I think works well with Riesling. Vegetable dishes, steamed fishes, like, again, Riesling is maybe the most versatile of the three wines we're tasting here. It works pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, what's been interesting to see lately is to see a lot of different cultures of wine starting to kind of like collide with specifically Southeast Asian food. In my recent travels, I've seen a lot of natural wines on menus in Filipino, in Thai, and Burmese restaurants. That's something that's important to us too. Would you say that specifically are you looking for that lane? Like, because if you think about Korean drinking culture, for example, there's, it's already there, right? There are foods that they are pairing. I don't know if that's most likely not the language they would use for it, but there's soju and soyu and specific beers and specific spirits that are, known to be not just the spirit itself, but the whole culture around it. Is that a lane for you to go for like Southeast Asian, for example, Thai and Burmese and Lao, as we're seeing this development of those kind of restaurants too?
It was 20 years ago. It was something I was really interested in, and then I think I got kind of beaten down over the last 20 years, and now it's like it's not a niche or a lane that I'm specifically like targeting, but I would like to. I don't actually go out and sell wine that often anymore. I mean, but I think if I did, I would like to go there, and we do try to encourage the people selling our wine to do that kind of thing. And we have wines that we think work well with that. And yeah, I mean, of course, like I said earlier, I would like to see Asian restaurants like kind of just have better offerings. And again, I think it's like, it can be sort of part of the Asian American food experience where like these things kind of come together. Wine obviously being like a very European tradition, but I don't think that means it doesn't have a place in an Asian restaurant, especially in this country.
And I mean, to Maya's point, right? This is where all my peers that are restaurant owners that are joining us tonight, to look a little deeper. I know for us, it's always been a value at the Me that we look specifically for BIPOC producers, and we created a whole pantry around that. But I want to encourage all people that drink wine and that eat these foods to also to look a little deeper, because I think that it's one thing to begin with a search, right? Because it also has to be excellent, right? We're not just looking for BIPOC producers, we're also in search of excellence. So I think it's a good time to think about, where is our wine coming from? I mean, I love French wines, I love Italian wines as much as anybody else, but this is a win-win scenario, right? Where you can buy from producers that already have, more obstacles, but also that is at a high standard of excellence. So I hope that we're all going to be eating and drinking awesome BIPOC wines with all food, but specifically Asian food really soon. And to your point about the time, that it's taken, that you've been at it for 20 years, and that now I think is the moment. I mean, in the conversations we've been having in this series for CULINASIA, there's a lot of hope among Asian American folks in the food system, right? Food folks is the way I've been referring to them, that, there's an opportunity for us to, as the title of our panel tonight, to look back, but then also with the intention of going forward. So, I mean, I guess I'm curious also in those 20 years, if you've seen if you've seen some hopeful evolution too.
Definitely. I mean, there's definitely more interest in wine in Asian restaurants. It has gotten, you know, I'm doing less of it, but I think it has gotten easier. And I think that people going to restaurants in general, not just Asian restaurants, but I do think that people going to restaurants or buying wine in stores or really anywhere are thinking about who's behind the wines. And I think there's talk in wine of the people being part of the terroir now. And I think that that's really important. It's like every time you're drinking something, you're sort of, you're in a way, I think we talked about this earlier, like you're voting with your dollars, you're making a choice, you're making a difference to somebody. And you're also sort of sending a message.
Mm-hmm.
And so as people have cared more about that, I think a better message is being sent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Kenny, I have two questions for you. One is actually pulling from a question that came up earlier in the chat about, like, I think it was all of us, about how we've chosen the land that we're on. And I'm curious for you, I don't really know a lot of vintners, just like how you all determined like where you wanted to grow. And was it like, yeah, in relation to like knowing the soil type and for growing like Riesling, or, you know, how you determined that? And then my other set of questions is about just in terms of like Asian wine production, especially in like Southeast Asia, East Asia, is that there's been a lot of like use of other fruit in alcohols, right? Or fermentations of fruit for wine, and wondering if that's something that you've drawn from at all in your wine production, you know, using other kinds of fruits or infusions or things like that. So
yeah, so I think like anything that you're farming, you know, we've looked for different varieties of grapes are sort of work well or work better in different areas. So we look for the right area for the right grape, and that's kind of why our like geographically we work from like all the way down in like the Chalon Arroyo Seco area all the way up to like northern Mendocino. And so we're kind of covering a very large span so that we can find the right kind of soil types and climatic situations for the grapes. Although, you know, again, like kind of to go back to many things that were said today, like climate change has thrown all this off quite drastic. You know, everything's changing. What 20 years ago made sense doesn't necessarily make sense now. And so we're all trying to like shift or pivot to see what makes sense now. But I mean, things are changing so quickly that what makes sense, and grapes are such a long-term farming investment. Like, you know, the vineyards that we farm, some of them are 100 years old. Others, you know, and so it's hard to plan like that when you don't know what's happening. But yeah, so that, I guess on that, you know, there is still like, we're still looking for the right grape in the right place and trying to do that. And then.
And Kenny said you kind of went more with like finding the right land for the grapes that you know you want to grow, as opposed to like finding land and being like, what grapes are going to go on this parcel.
Yeah, so we haven't the vineyards that we've taken over the farming on, all have been planted. We haven't, up until very recently, we've never planted a vineyard. So it was really like only being sort of interested in what was already there, and to us seemed like the right fit. So yeah, so it's more like, I guess, going to working with what's already there. But trying to find the right situation that makes sense, and makes sense not just like for the climate, for the variety, but also in terms of like being able to be more environmental about the farming, and like sites that aren't necessarily, like, we prefer sites that don't necessarily need to be irrigated, or just sites where you can make the right decisions, basically. And there's a pretty large variation in California. And then to answer your second question, I maybe like 15 or 17 years ago, I did experiment a little bit with making pineapple wine. I was kind of interested in that. It was very difficult to do. I don't think we got to a place that was to a good product. But I also just started kind of realizing it's like the environmental impact of us in California, like in Northern California, trying to make pineapple wine it just wasn't a very good setup. There's no, like, we can't really grow pineapples. Like I'd either have to import them from somewhere, or, you know, and the transportation involved, or it just, so I think, like, you know, for us to make fruit wines, it only makes sense if we can grow the fruits in where we are. So in that right now, that's like mostly things like apple cider and maybe like plum wine.
Yeah, lots of ume around. So there's always that possibility. Cool. Thanks for
Yeah, I haven't tried that. That could be interesting. Should we move to wine 2? So wine number 2 is this wine called White Light. And it's a blend that we do, a proprietary blend of, it also has Riesling like the first wine, but it has a grape called Tokai Friulano. It has Verdelho, and then it has a little bit of Sauvignon Blanc. And these are actually all varieties that I think individually work well with Asian foods. And so this blend definitely, like, it's very versatile, and I think works with like a large, like, kind of sampling of different types of Asian foods. The Riesling in it gives it a lot of acid. The Friulano gives it a lot of saltiness, and then kind of the Verdelho and the Sauvignon Blanc give it a nice aromatic.
Can we see the color of the wine you're drinking, Kenny? We just want to, like,
pretty clear.
Yeah.
Can you see that? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I like, especially when I'm thinking about kind of pairing with Asian foods, I like white wines that are pretty lean and light. And so the color is going to kind of go along with that. The color would get darker if we started trying to do more extraction and make the wines heavier. But then I also don't think, we do make some wines like that, but I don't think they work as well with Asian foods.
Can you say a little bit about why not?
Well, so one of the things that would give you color in a wine is oak. And to me, like, if you're drinking a wine that is oaky with a lot of Asian foods, it really accentuates the oak to where you start to feel like you're just drinking wood and not wine. I don't tend to love that flavor really anyway, but it's really kind of brought out by a lot of Asian foods, and it doesn't work well with it. So, and then, I mean, the other thing, I guess, that would give you color is leaving something, like if you're fermenting something, leaving it on the skins longer, and then you're going to get tannin, and tannin also just doesn't work that well with Asian food.
I also think that in tropical climates, you know, we're used to drinking beverages that are cold, right? The faludas and the, you know, and the dessert drinks and everything. I mean, ice cold beer. And so it's kind of, it's almost like a layer of nostalgia that doesn't exist, but that you can still connect to. Just having, you know, something that is cold that goes with that huge range of flavors in Southeast Asian cooking specifically, right? Where you have salty, sweet, sour, crunchy, spicy, like all those flavors together. They need something that has a little bit of character, but is not so heavy that it almost gives like a mush. No, like that's been my experience. All the reds, not all, we had a few, but some of the reds that we, you know, experimented with Burmese food, which probably, you know, hardly exists in Burma at all. The whole country has a total of 2 vineyards. For me, it just felt like the flavors between wine and food then just became like, they almost like cancel each other out, you know?
Right. Yeah, I think so. I
mean, no one is winning in this scenario.
Yeah, exactly. I think that, yeah, one way, like the food can either just kind of mute the wine, but like if you have a really tannic wine, it just mutes the food as well. Yeah, they're difficult.
And what do you have for us? What is the third wine that you have?
Okay, so the third one is the Banyan Gewürztraminer. So these days, the Banyan label just has one wine, and it's this Gewürztraminer, and it has the label has an image of a longboat from Thailand. This is like kind of the classic pairing for Thai food. The wine tends to have the sort of lychee sort of flavor that goes well with a lot of Thai food. It also has a fair amount of acid, and like Riesling, there can be a range of sweetness levels. Over the years, our version of this wine has gotten drier. Not because I think it pairs necessarily better with foods drier, but mostly because of climate change, and we have less acid, and so I don't think we have enough acid to necessarily stand up to a lot of residual sugar in the wine. So we've made the wine drier to just be a more balanced wine. This, for me, my favorite pairing is Somtom with this. And I've kind of, we've made this wine for 20 years, and I always, before we ever bottle it, I always have it out of the tank with Somtom to make sure it works, because we've been saying that it's our favorite pairing with for this wine for 20 years, so I always want to make sure that that's true.
Well, it's funny that you said that, because we used to, in our pre-service meeting with our team, we used to have them taste wines and tell us, what they'd pair them with. We like to be a little bit loose in our training and not as structured in terms of like, what do you want to eat, right? You're serving this wine, and what do you want to eat? And I would say that, that Gewürztraminer specifically goes with so much. I mean, fried foods, lightly fried, right? Some of the more lightly fried foods, our fish, our salads. I mean, it was just so incredibly versatile. I think that, Asians have this kind of adage, like we say oranges are Asian dessert, right? Where we don't like stuff that's too sweet all the time. And of course, not to generalize across all cultures, but I know a lot of Asian desserts are sort of heralded for being a little bit less sweet. So I think that that's something really useful in the wine pairings, that the wine is sweet, but not too sweet.
Yeah, for sure.
And Kenny, do you mind? Can you show us all 3 bottles for the people who are at home, maybe just kind of one by one? Because as we're wrapping up,
that was number 3, the Banyan Gewürztraminer. Number 2 was Folk Machine White Light. Sorry.
Oh, I love this label.
Number 1, the number 1's hard to see on but number 1 is the Folk Machine Riesling.
So beautiful. I want them all. I'm gonna send you my address here.
Please do.
Family, all of our siblings. Speaking of family, we have all these people. Kenny, thank you so much for tasting these wines with us. I think you're giving us a lot of FOMO, but also specifically, it's exciting to see such a broad representation. And as we have our family in the room, I just wanted to give each of the panelists, maybe we have just 1 minute each to close out. If there's a call to action or a call to invite our audience to take action as we are in the last of our series towards a more healthy and equitable future for Asian food and Asian ingredients. Kristin?
I don't have anything in particular to call you all to action for, but yeah, I appreciate what Mai had just said earlier about considering the role that everyone has to play in terms of just, actually fostering the type of food relationships that we want to see, and supporting the people that are, growing and tending to this food and these stories. And I know, there's some federal things, like in terms of debt relief, that would specifically help BIPOC farmers and producers, that is, being met with some contention nationally. And I think probably Mai and Ari have more specific ways that you can, get involved and support that. But yeah.
That's it. Just like, that's it. Mai and +1.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I was thinking too.
yeah, calls to action. Well, with this wine tasting, my to-do list action is just like, after harvest, I'm gonna find Kenny because we're in the same county, and I'll bring over some pie, which is kind of sweet. Maybe we can figure out a wine pairing by going through your entire wine collection.
Let's definitely do that.
Sweet. And collective call to action is end white supremacy. Thank you.
Ari.
I don't know that there's much more to add to that, but
What do you say after that?
what do you say after that? I agree. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important for people to pay attention to what's going on in the climate and what the daily reality is for farmers. I think everyone should be very concerned and should be doing as much as they can to advocate for a good climate policy that includes farmers and centers BIPOC farmers specifically. This doesn't have as much to do with Asian American farmers, but I think it's always really critical to support Indigenous efforts for land sovereignty. I think that is just the way forward for all of us. And so, yeah, as much as you can be informed and involved and call your representatives when necessary, I think that's really helpful.
Thank you, Ari. Kenny?
I would echo the climate change battle. I think that's something we're all in together, and none of this good work keeps going unless that problem is dealt with.
Yeah, and on that vein, if you are here with us, then I imagine that you're a person who eats. And if you're a person who eats, then this is for all of us. I want to really, truly and sincerely thank all of you for engaging and insightful conversation. As I said already, I could sit here with all of you for another 4 hours gladly. Thank you specifically, Mai, Ari, Kenny, and Kristin. And thank you again to the Asian Pacific American Initiatives Pool and administered by the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center for making this program possible, and all of the 3 preceding it. A note before you go to our audience, please complete our survey that will pop up as you exit the program. We value your thoughts and feedback, and I wish all of you a really beautiful evening. I hope you have everything you need and more in abundance. Thank you again, and cheers to the future of Asian food in America. Good night.